Hey guys, it's Ryan here with HobbiesofaMan once again, and today we're doing another comic book review. Today we're looking at an epic collection. This is the first epic collection that I own, and well, technically I guess that's not true because I do have the Jack Kirby run of the Eternals, and even though that's not technically an epic collection, it is exactly the same as an epic collection, right? It's not an omnibus or a compendium. It's smaller than that, but it's still within the same kind of format style with a lot of issues, preferably collecting like a whole run or near a whole run's worth of stuff. And it's about the same length as the one we're looking at today, which is the X-Men, the Children of the Atom, which is book one in the series. It's from 1963 all the way to 1966. And this was pretty awesome. I actually really enjoyed it. I had never read through X-Men comic books at all. I've been a big fan of the X-Men movies throughout my life, mostly because that's been like the most constant set of superhero movies throughout my life that have been, generally good, except for the last few. But X-Men First Class was phenomenal. I really, really enjoyed that one. And this is basically the same thing as X-Men First Class, but this is actually like the good version of it, where the X-Men in the First Class movie were not really the original X-Men. This obviously is the original X-Men because this is the original series. And this is written by Stan Lee with art initially by Jack Kirby and then by another creator who goes by Jay Gavin in the comics, but actually is called Werner Roth. And Roy Thomas takes over the writing duties in the second half of the book, actually near the end of the book. And I think he continues on to be the main writer for X-Men for a while before he transitions away to do other stuff, right? But it's kind of interesting because this is not quite the earliest stuff. I think Fantastic Four came before X-Men, at least a little bit, right? But Stan Lee really kind of starts the thing off, kind of creates the basic mythos, and then moves on. That's other people do it, and it seems like Roy Thomas really is the one that takes on responsibility for a lot of this stuff early on, and I liked it. I think it's cool. Overall, very, very good book. This covers the first 23 issues, which feels like a lot, but then by the end of it, you feel like maybe they could have added a few more issues in because it just feels like it doesn't quite work out. And also just because I'm a bit weird sometimes. I feel like ending on 23 when the next one was 24, and that's a much better rounded number, is kind of annoying. But also maybe there is a reason for this. Maybe that is the last issue that was published in 1966, or maybe, this is like the transition away from the early stuff into more like a different set of plot lines. I'm not really sure. It works out. By the end of it, you're like, okay, this works. This is a good ending. It's, auto-conclusive, most of the stories in here, so it's not too bad. It's just a bit weird from a numbers perspective for me, but it's not bad at all. This is what the spine looks like. It looks really cool. I do want to get more of these. I think that this idea, this epic collection concept is great. I quite like it. It's better than omnibuses because although I like the idea of omnibuses, reading books that are just so massive and so heavy is kind of annoying, right? Since I don't have a nice stand for books, I would have to carry them in my hand or find a way that I can sit on the sofa and have it resting on something else, and that's just kind of annoying. I don't want to sit at my desk where the angle isn't correct for me to enjoy reading, so it makes it hard, which is why I haven't read the Aquaman omnibus that I have, even though I really want to, right? So yeah, but moving on from this is obviously published by Marvel, and the demographic here is teenagers. It's very clearly for teenagers because the subtitle for X-Men is The Strangest Teenagers Ever or something like that. Let's see what it actually is. The Teenage Superheroes Who Have Taken America by Storm is one of the subtitles for one of the books here. Let's see. There's another one that I remember quite clearly. Let's see. The Strangest Teen Superheroes of All Time or something like that. Is what it was, right? So the genres here are superhero and sci-fi, although the sci-fi elements here are less prominent and less important than they are in something like Fantastic Four, right? I call it sci-fi, even though it's not quite sci-fi, because a lot of the stuff that is here could be magical, but really is supposed to be portrayed through the lens of science, like something about genetic mutations and something about science and something about aliens and something about robots works in a scientific way, not a magical way, right? So that's why it's sci-fi, in my opinion. And I think most people would agree with that. X-Men are a sci-fi based superhero team. And it does have an adaptation, but obviously it's not a direct adaptation. Like the X-Men First Class movie takes the elements that we see here and kind of plays with them a little bit, introduces different types of characters to use instead of these that are introduced to us here in order to kind of recreate the same basic idea of the story, right? And the rating for this book is a 4 out of 5, mostly because within the whole book, there's quite a few issues that are just a slog to get through, and it's not necessarily bad. Like, it's just kind of annoying that you kind of enjoy this storyline, and then the next one just kind of sucks. And also because there's a lot of reuse of the same plot line, not even periodically. It feels like one storyline ends, and then the next storyline is exactly the same concept, but with some tweaks here and there so it doesn't look the same. And so I didn't like that particularly either, but at the same time, if you're one guy doing everything, it feels kind of understandable, which is nice when Roy Thomas takes over, that it seems like maybe things are changing a little bit, right? But, your mileage may vary there. You might think that this is better than me. You might think it's worse, actually, because of the way that the comic books are structured here is a bit different from before, or a bit different from what you might be used to as a modern reader, right? So the premise is that there's this guy, his name is Professor Xavier, and he's wheelchair bound, and he seems to have kinetic abilities, right? The psychokinetic abilities, or ESP. He has telepathy. He has the ability to send and receive brain waves and, basically read minds or talk to you in your mind and stuff like that, right? And he's gathered a group of boys, 4 of them, together to become protectors of humanity and ambassadors for this new sub-race of humanity that has shown up called the mutants, right? And in the first issue, we get introduced to a 5th member of the team who happens to be the first girl mutant that we see throughout the story. And actually, she ends up being one of the only 2 throughout most of the book, actually. Most of the stuff that we see here is mostly male characters, right? And so Professor Xavier and these 5 young teenagers become the de facto face of the mutant cause, right? And they end up fighting against other mutants who happen to not have the same moral fiber that these characters have, right? And it's pretty cool. I really enjoyed it. I think that it has a nice vibe to it. And if they made an animated edition of this, like an animated adaptation of this, they could follow this pretty well, pretty directly, and make it pretty interesting and long-lasting, because something like this already exists and has worked really well, which is, of course, My Hero Academia, right? And, of course, they did try to do this. I think X-Men Generations was the same kind of concept where the characters were actually in high school, right? And I used to like watching that when I was a kid. So, this concept works, and it would be nice to have it adapted from the get-go in the original concept, although the schooling aspect kind of would fall apart pretty quickly because they don't actually spend very much time in school. They're mostly training in the danger room, right? So yeah, the plot line is pretty interesting. I'm not going to focus on every issue. I will just kind of give you highlights here and there because each issue is basically self-contained. Sometimes the story is going to 2 or 3 issues, but broadly speaking, there is kind of like a linear timeline, and each adventure is separate from each other, but they all kind of coalesce into this timeline of events that the characters go through. And so there is some growth between Scott Summers in issue 20 and Scott Summers in issue 1, right? Although the growth is very, very slow. And honestly, you could probably argue that it's not there. It's just that you're so used to seeing this character that when he does something slightly differently, you can be like, oh, well, he probably had this kind of concept come up over time, right? So I won't focus on every issue. I'll give you kind of a full run through of the first issue, and then we'll talk about different issues and some of the stuff that they bring to the table, right? So first issue opens up with Professor X bringing the boys together at his mansion, and we get introduced to the 4 boys that work there already, or that are already there, which are Scott Summers, Cyclops, Warren Worthington III, Angel, Bobby Drake, whose name is Iceman, and Henry McCoy, or Hank McCoy, who is the Beast, right? So Cyclops has his visor because his eyes constantly shoot out beams of concussive energy. The Angel has angel wings, and Iceman forces his body to turn to ice. Although in the first issue, he's not very refined, and so he kind of looks more like a snowman than an Iceman. And the Beast, of course, just kind of looks a little bit like a monkey. His feet are really big. They're not really hand-shaped, but they're not really normal foot shaped either. It's just kind of like he's a little bit stout, he's wide, and he has big feet that have a lot more pliability than your feet might have, right? And they show off their powers pretty easily, doing a set of exercises to kind of show off what they're doing, which is pretty awesome. And as they're training, they're joking around. We get to know that they are all friends to an extent. Also, they're all different ages, and they're all teenagers, and so they're all going through their own problems and situations, and so they actually kind of come off adversarial against each other as well, right? So Scott Summers is kind of like the anal retentive character. He's kind of like trying to keep everyone, on pace. Beast is very intelligent, but he's a little kind of condescending, and he uses big words when he doesn't need to. Bobby Drake is like the younger character, so he's kind of annoying. And Warren is kind of like the cool, suave guy, right? So they finish their training, and then we see that a young woman arrives. And it turns out that this woman, this young girl, teenage girl, is Jean Grey, who is going to be the 5th X-Man. And she has teleportation powers. And actually, that's wrong. She has telekinesis, which is different from what Professor X has, which is telepathy, right? But I think this was a mistake on Stan's part. He just didn't know the right word. And so what he meant was teleportation, because she can use her mind to move objects from one place to the next, right? Whereas teleportation usually means moving objects across like distance with your mind or with a tool or something else, right? It doesn't imply the same concept, but you can kind of understand what he's saying, right? She uses her mind to move one item here over there, so she's using telekinesis to transport things, so she's using teleportation powers. Not quite right? Something like Kurt Wagner, what's his name? The blue demon-looking guy. I can't remember what his code name is, right? He would have teleportation powers, right? Not Jean Grey, but whatever. It doesn't really make too much of a difference. And the boys are a bit dumb around her because I guess they haven't seen a woman in a while since they've all been living in this mansion by themselves, right? And obviously they try to kind of court her, but they're kind of sexist about it because it's the 1960s and Stan Lee is writing. And she is pretty interesting because she has a bit of a spine to her. She doesn't just let them say shit to her. She kind of doesn't let it go. And she is like, no, boys, don't worry, I'm good. She shows her powers off to kind of chastise them a little bit. And then they all want to be ready to stand up against evil when evil comes. And this is when we transition away to see that there are evil mutants. And we meet Magneto, who is supposed to have powers of magnetism. He is supposed to be able to use magnetic currents or magnetic fields and, kind of mess with them, right? But the way that he uses powers really just feels like he has telekinesis and telepathy. So he kind of counters Professor Xavier and Jean Grey by himself, right? I think that as the story progresses and other creators show up and more sci-fi writers kind of work through the kinks in the story, they kind of ease back on some of those ESP type powers that Magneto has, and they kind of focus mostly on just he controls elements that are magnetic, which is most metals, right? Or he controls metals, right? He doesn't have magnetic field powers. He has magnet powers or metal powers, right? As we go forward. But, I could be wrong because I haven't really read any other X-Men titles beforehand. I just know from the movies, he doesn't really have ESP powers. He just has the ability to metal bend, right? And he is introduced to us by taking over a military base, right? The X-Men are immediately sent to help because Professor Xavier kind of hears the thought processes of people across the world somehow without using Cerebro. And he sends the X-Men to help, and somehow they manage to force Magneto to leave the base. They don't actually beat him, they just kind of run him off, and so the base is returned to the military, and the characters are successful on their first outing, but over the book we see that they train and they grow their powers, and they fail a few times, and their failure is important because it helps them grow. Like, the characters do seem to change and develop their presence and their desires throughout the story, which is great because that's something that we don't really see in modern comic books, right? So that's the end of the first issue. Then we jump over to issue 3, which introduces us to the Blob, who is a very physically imposing character. He's a giant, kind of like fat guy, and his kind of powers is that when he sets his mind to it, he's kind of immovable. So he and the Juggernaut actually share kind of a lot of powers to an extent, but the Juggernaut is kind of like a unstoppable force, whereas the Blob is more of like an immovable object kind of concept, right? And he has super strength to an extent, but for whatever reason, he ends up looking like a big fat man, and so he ends up being a sideshow at a circus, right? And this is when the characters find him, and he's kind of outcast from society because of how he looks. And as he interacts with the X-Men, we realize that he's not really a good person, and so he's not going to join them, and the X-Men have to fight a circus because of him, right? And eventually Professor X erases his memory, and he gets put back in the toy box for later, right? In issue 4, we get introduced to the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. This is Magneto's team, which includes Toad, who has the same relationship with Magneto that Wormtail has with Voldemort in the movies. We have Mastermind, who is kind of an asshole character who thinks that just because he can create illusions, he should be, the leader of the team, although Magneto has more physically imposing powers. And we get the Maximoff twins, right? We get Wanda, who is called the Scarlet Witch, and she has hex powers. I don't know how that's a science-based power, but that's what it is. She can basically affect the luck of other people or put curses on them to an extent. And we have Quicksilver, her brother, Pietro Maximoff, who has super speed, right? Although his super speed doesn't seem to be on the same level as the Flash is at this point. He just moves a lot faster than everyone else. But I think some of the characters can see him moving. They just can't react fast enough to deal with him, right? And through their fight with the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, Professor X seems to lose his powers due to an explosion, right? Then the next issue focuses on the team having to save Angel from the Brotherhood, and when they succeed, Professor X shows off that he still had his powers. He had been acting like he didn't in order to provide a test for his team, and he sees that they have definitely grown and that they have succeeded, and so they become graduates, and they're no longer students of the X-Men Institute. I guess they are now full members of society, and they are full-fledged X-Men, right? And they passed. And the problem is that Professor X kind of gets portrayed as a bit of an asshole guy. Like, he has the best interest in mind of the world, but he's kind of a piece of shit at the same time, which I like. I think it's interesting. It makes it kind of harder to root for him, but also like interesting to realize that you have to, because the alternative is bad, right? And so I like this. I think it's cool. There's also, in one of these early issues, the start of a romantic kind of subplot with Jean Grey. Of course, she's introduced and immediately all the guys want to get with her, but it's kind of weird because even Professor X has like a situation where he's like, oh, I love you, and I can't tell you that because it wouldn't be proper. And it's like, dude, you're like 40 and she's like 16, 17. That's really fucking weird, right? But of course it doesn't go anywhere because he doesn't say anything, so it's fine. And this plot line immediately disappears. It's never followed up again. But it does kind of start leading us to the idea that Jean Grey is a female member of the team, an important member of the team, but also a character that will have romantic subplots, particularly with Warren III and with Scott Summers going forward, right? Mostly she likes Scott and Warren wants to get with her, but she's not really all that interested in him, right? So we transition away, we continue through the issues, we get to issue 7, which brings back the Blob, and this is when Scott is assigned the position of team leader while they're away because Professor X has something else to do, right? And they deal with him. Again, it doesn't quite work out the way they wanted to, but they do end up winning against the Blob, which is great. Issue 8 introduces us to Unus, or Unus, I'm not really sure how to say that. It's U-N-U-S. And he and the Blob have similar powers, but the mechanics behind them are different, where the Blob can physically take any damage and can withstand attacks and force against him. Unus kind of deflects it, right? And the team has to beat him with science because they can't beat him with their powers. And so what they do is create a situation in which Unus's powers get elevated, more powerful, and when this happens, Unus can't control them anymore, and so he can't grab anything. He can't exist within the boundaries of society. He can't eat, he can't sit, he can't do anything. And so he begs them to give him the cure to his powers, right? To make them smaller again, so he can control them, right? And so they do this and have him promise that he will never turn to villainy again. And he promises, and so they let him go, and he gets put away in the toy box for later, right? This is when the Jean and Scott Summers romance subplot really starts showing up. Mostly it's Jean pining for Scott, Scott pining for Jean, and both of them not realizing that they could just talk to each other and have a relationship if they wanted to, right? Issue 10 introduces us to Kazar, which is cool. I didn't know Kazar was introduced through X-Men, but I guess the Savage Land is technically an X-Men location, right? And so the Savage Land is based on Pellucidar. So in Antarctica, if you find the entrance, you can go down into this hidden world that is a majestic, ancient version of Earth, where there's saber-toothed cats and dinosaurs and ancient humans and all sorts of things. And Kazar, in a Tarzan-esque kind of way, ends up living there with his buddy, the saber-toothed tiger, right? Which is pretty cool. I liked it. I thought it was interesting. Kazar has the same kind of personality traits as the Submariner, where he's like, dude, I'm the best. You guys are stupid, but I will allow you to join me on this quest, right? And they do. And Kazar is like, I don't want anyone to come here again. I will close the entrance away, and Kazar will live by himself in the Savage Land, right? Issue 12 brings us Professor X's origin story. We get to learn that he was a young mutant from the very get-go. He knew he had powers, and his father was killed in an accident that was meant to kill him, and he was taken in by someone else, a guy called Marco or Darko or something like that. And this guy had a son who ends up being the character that becomes the Juggernaut. And so they're not siblings, they're step-siblings, but they did grow up together, right? And this is a really good story. I actually really, really enjoyed it. We get to see Professor X and the Juggernaut become soldiers, fight in the war. Somehow Professor X loses his ability to walk, and the Juggernaut is sealed away in a cave after he gets his Juggernaut powers by wearing the bands of Sidorak. And later, it turns out that Juggernaut has arrived after years and years in order to have revenge on his brother for leaving him there in this cave, right? The story continues on to the next issue, and it's pretty cool. Issues 14 through 16 give us the start of the Sentinels. Bolivar Trask is a character that exists. He is a well-known scientist of some sort, and he realizes that the mutants pose a menace to humanity in this kind of way in which we understand that humanity probably led to the destruction of the Neanderthals. They think that Homo superior might lead to the destruction of normal Homo sapiens. And I can kind of understand this, but at the same time, it's like, dude, there's like 10 mutants and like 7 billion humans. Like, there's no way that they can do that. I mean, sure, they can still hurt you, and they can probably do a lot of damage, but there's so few of them that you could easily get rid of them if you really needed to. You don't have to do all of this crazy shit. And also, does it matter if humans and mutants interbreed? There's more likelihood that there's going to be more mutants, and then humanity just becomes mutant kind, which is what happens to most things as they evolve, right? They become the thing that's most advantageous to them. And so really, you're not dying out. You're just gonna it's really stupid in my opinion. And so that's the one part of the X-Men that I don't like. Mostly it's been non-important, but this is really the start of like the mutant menace and the humans hating mutants for no reason, because people don't hate for no reason. People hate, and then they justify their hatred, and their justifications make sense within some confines of logic to themselves, even if it's not necessarily correct or logical. In the broader scheme, it makes sense to them. And the mutant menace kind of idea doesn't make sense at all. Like, a scientist would know that evolution doesn't work that way, and that evolution will mean that everyone will eventually have powers. So what's the point in having this issue with them at the point, right? And also, normal people would have to have a bad experience with mutants before they start thinking that mutants are bad, right? Like, there's no... It doesn't make sense to me. It feels too, like, arbitrary. And just for the sake of having conflict, like in a melodramatic sense, but it is not well established or well thought out. So I end up not liking it that much, right? And so the Sentinel thing is pretty cool. The Sentinels end up becoming self-aware. It has like a Terminator plot where they take on their original creator and force him to make more of them. He doesn't do so, and so they kill him. And at the end, he kills everything when he dies, and realizes that he was wrong about the mutants, right? So that's cool. Issue 19 has Mimic, which is a interesting story type where our characters have to face off against someone else that has the same power set as them. But it's not really well made, in my opinion. This story had the ability to prove to us that the characters have grown by having them realize, oh, this character knows our powers, but he doesn't know how to use them the same way we do. And so even though he's one person that has all 5 of our powers, he doesn't have the training or the mental capacity to use them all at the same time. And that's where we can overcome him because we have each trained ourselves, right? But that's not actually how the story works. He manages to beat them up pretty easily, multiple times, and then the way they kill him or they beat him is by forcing his powers away because they were given to him in an accident, right? His ability was to copy others' powers or others' abilities through some weird science experiment gone wrong, right? And so I think that this was a storyline that would have been very interesting to see through, but for whatever reason, probably because this is the early days of this sort of storytelling happening, the characters the writers didn't take advantage of the story the way that they should have, which kind of sucks. This is also the last story that Stan Lee does by himself. This is when the transition to Roy Thomas starts happening, and it's kind of funny that the story that I think had the most potential and was least elaborated on is the one that Stan Lee finishes off with, right? Issue 20, like I said, Roy Thomas takes over, and this is a story that brings back the Blob and Unis, who are together now, back. And then we get introduced to the Lucifer Indominus plot later on, which is just a rehash of the Sentinel plot, but this time it's from space instead of from Earth. And then we have a bit of a transitionary set of issues that just kind of deal with some ridiculous old villain characters from the era before the 1960s when Marvel became a thing, right? So overall, pretty fun. I really enjoyed reading through this. There's also something to be said about older comics because they just have so much text and so much stuff going on that they feel very satisfying to read in the sense of like, oh, I read through that and I spent a long time with it and it was pretty enjoyable and I felt like I got my money's worth from it, right? That's something that I don't really feel all that often with modern comic books, where it's like, oh, that was an awesome feeling of elation at the end of the issue, but I flew through the issue. It took me 5 minutes to read, whereas some of these issues might take me 15, right? Just because they have so much stuff going on, so much dialogue. And a lot of it is repetitive and stupid and unnecessarily melodramatic, but it adds a lot when you realize, oh, each one of these bits of dialogue is stupid and melodramatic, but yet it helps us understand some of these characters a bit better. It gives us characterization. It gives us an understanding of why Beast is the way he is, or why Warren does this, or his feelings, or Jean's pining. You know, this stuff helps you connect with the characters a bit more, and it makes it feel like it matters, even if you kind of feel like you're scoffing at all the dialogue because it's just so annoyingly like trite, right? So it's kind of interesting. I found it to be an enjoyable experience overall. In terms of characters, we have Scott Summers, who's a fatalistic young leader character. He basically has a fear of his powers getting out of control, but it's not explained why he has this fear. Like, I understand, okay, your powers are destructive, but they're not explosive, they're concussive. And so there is something that shouldn't be, that should be able to stop it eventually, right? Or just close your freaking eyes. Like, I don't see why he's so afraid. And, you know, it's kind of easy, like, oh, he hurt his father when he was a child, or he hurt his mom, or when his powers awakened, you know, whatever. It's just not explained to us. And so he's kind of constantly moping about the fact that his powers are destructive, and it's never explained to us. And so it kind of gets annoying instead of meaningful, right? Henry McCoy is fun. He's a dramatic, intelligent guy. He's basically like if a theater kid was like scientifically autistic is what I will go with. Like, he has that kind of vibe where he's like very eloquent and dramatic and speaks a lot, but also it's like, dude, you could just say the same thing you just said in 3 words instead of the 12 that you use. Like, calm down, right? Warren Worthington III is the cool rich guy. He's kind of a playboy character. He's fun. Bobby Drake is the younger brother character. He's kind of silly, and he has a bit of a chip on his shoulder, especially later on in the story. We see that it bothers him that all the guys think that he's not that good just because he's young, right? And he wants to prove himself, and I like that. I think he's an interesting character to follow. And Jean Grey, of course, is the cute girl. She's very pretty. She's a good person. She has a romantic outlook on life, and she also has a lot of powers. And she is actually the one that seems to develop the most, because initially she can do telekinesis, but then she can apply telekinesis to herself, and she kind of flies by kind of seemingly riding a broom made out of her telekinetic powers. She kind of looks like a witch riding a broom most of the time that she does that. And she can control other people. She can lift them. She can help them fly. She can help them fall softly. She has a lot of growth, even though it's not actually focused on. She has a lot of abilities that are useful for the whole thing, right? So I like her. Also, most of the time, the guys do kind of say sexist things to her, and they kind of have this like, oh, honey, you know, we're good, we're better than you, we're strong, we got this. But she doesn't let that get to her, and she kind of shows them up sometimes, and I like that. I think it's enjoyable to see that she has independence to her, and it's not just like a meek little like seen but not heard kind of character, right? And Professor X is a bit mysterious. He's a bit of a know-it-all. He's also kind of an asshole, but he's not that bad. I just think it's interesting that you have this character who has such great ambition to protect humanity, and then you look at how he acts by himself, and it's like, oh, you're kind of a bitch, like you're kind of a dick. Like, why is this the character that wants to save the world, right? And Magneto is a bit of a megalomaniac, and that's really all there is to him. The Brotherhood of Mutants is not really well developed, but there's definitely a lot of conflict there because they're all ruled by fear. That's why they're kept together by Magneto. He doesn't want cooperation. He wants control, right? And so they're not really well developed, but they're used to develop Magneto's understanding, right? So it's pretty cool. In terms of world building, the mutant hate narrative is too on the nose, and I don't think it's well developed because, like I said, people don't hate for no reason. There is something that forces them to rationalize their hatred eventually, right? People... You know, it's common to say that people hate what they don't understand, and that's true to an extent. But usually, people don't make up their mind on things by themselves. They have to hear it from someone else first. And I don't see who would be saying that the mutants are bad when they've saved military bases, they've done everything they can to be good people, especially the X-Men. And then when bad guys show up, they fight them. And like, how do you know that they're mutants, right? Like, no one seems to hate the Avengers or the Fantastic Four when they show up in the crossovers, but everyone seems to hate the mutants, right? And it's like, how can you tell the difference? Like, every single power set basically looks the same because you don't know what DNA is made up of, right? Like, you can't like look at the Submariner and be like, oh yeah, he's a mutant. And it's like, well, what if he's just a fish guy? Like, how do you know what it is, right? And so that kind of plot line doesn't make too much sense to me, and it's just kind of annoying. And then the aliens and stuff is pretty cool. I like it. Although the way that a lot of these characters just seem to have ESP as like a sub like power is kind of interesting and not very thought out. Like, it makes sense that Professor X would have ESP powers and astral project and all this stuff, right? Because his power is like ESP, right? But why does Magneto have the same abilities? Like, he can also astral project and do all this stuff. And it's like, I don't know how controlling metal gives you those powers, right? So it doesn't really make too much sense. In terms of artwork and fan service, there's no fan service. I mean, unless you think that a woman dressing normally for the time period is like fan service. Basically, there's no cheesecake elements at all. There's pretty good art. It's mostly consistent, especially when Werner takes over. And I do think that, sadly, I think Werner Roth's ability to draw these characters is a bit better than Jack Kirby's, and I wonder why that is. You know, maybe Jack Kirby's being overworked at this point. Maybe Jack Kirby's not really interested in the X-Men, or maybe it's just that he's limited by the fact that he is a really good artist, but only within certain confines, right? Like, he doesn't have the ability to draw 6 different male character archetypes. He can maybe do 2 or 3, and then he kind of works within those, right? And all these characters have to be different constantly, and maybe that makes it harder, or maybe it's just the inkers weren't that good in this case. I'm not really sure what the issue was, but I do think that I end up liking Werner Roth's drawing for the X-Men better than Jack Kirby's, which is a bit of a shame because I think Jack Kirby's art is really phenomenal most of the time, right? Especially, I think it probably is the inker, because Werner Roth inks and like the way that Werner Roth's art looks is also kind of a bit inconsistent, but then eventually they do get the right inker and it just looks great going forward, and I really like it. I hope that we continue on with Roth for the next Epic collection as well. So the rating is a 4 out of 5 for me. Pretty awesome, but there's some drags to this, of course. Like I said, the Mutant Menace plotline doesn't make too much sense to me. The art inconsistencies bother me a little bit, not as much as in other books that I've mentioned before, but they do bother me just a bit. And the fact that some of the issues are just like complete garbage and like a slog to get through, right? But they're not really that bad, and in the whole scheme, like 2 or 3 issues out of 23 being not that fun is not really that big of a deal, especially because they're self-contained. So on a reread, or if you're a bit more savvy, you can kind of just skip through them and read through a review of the issue instead of reading through the issue itself, right? So there's ways that you can minimize the impact of this, but since I had not read this before, I just wanted to go in and read through all of it, and well, I was a bit disappointed by some of the issues. But yeah, those are my thoughts here overall on X-Men. I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.